It's a great pleasure to be here with you this evening. It's really quite wonderful, actually. I know this is a new service. It's a smaller one. You're building it up and so on. But you're a part of something much bigger and more powerful than just a small group of people who have gathered. And I was reminded of this, if I can go off script for a second, just as we started this service. Last year, my wife and I had a few months sabbatical, and we went to France to spend time with a religious community, an ecumenical Catholic community called Chemin Neuf, which means a sort of new way. And one of the first things we did was go to this conference that they ran, had put on, an ecumenical conference. It brought Anglicans and Dominicans and Catholics of various kinds together. And it was at this very famous monastery in southern France called the Abbey of Dombes. It's one of the most famous 19th century, so relatively recent monasteries. It used to be run by the Cistercians. And you go there, you see a monument to several of the Cistercian brothers who were executed by Gestapo forces during World War II for hiding people and so on and so forth. And more recently, it was famous because it was the site of a number of famous discussions amongst Catholics and Protestants and so on. And it's now taken over by this community called Chemin Neuf, which is a wonderful community of men and women, single, married families. They're mostly Catholic, but they have non-Catholic members. A wonderful ministry with young people. So here was this conference, and we went into the first service. There's several hundred people there. And Chemin Neuf, they wear these white robes when they do things, so they look very monastic in that sense, although normally they're not. And then there were, these visitors and bishops and this, and then the people from the surrounding villages were there. So there's several hundred people. You walk into this marvelous old, huge chapel, and there's silence, and then everybody went down on their knees and lifted up their hands, and they sang, "Here I am to worship." I just thought of that. And what I want to say is, you gather here and sing something like this. You are part of something. We are part of something that crosses the globe in the body of Christ. It touches me very much to know that. So thank you for having me be a part of this. So I'm here to talk a little bit about this notion of creation, and we're being creatures. And this is starting off some of the talks, as Jeff mentioned, that will be happening here at the church around this theme. I want to start with just telling you something about my father. My father, who is still alive at age 92, spent his working life as an applied mathematician. So he prided himself in his logic, rigorous thinking, evidence, demonstration, and so on. And yet he loved beautiful things. And it bothered him that he could never explain them. He enjoyed, for instance, hiking every summer in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. He knew all wildflowers by heart. He'd take photos of them and everything. And I remember one evening at dinner out there when he paused and sighed, and then he said, well, the pink Indian paintbrush, which is a very common Rocky Mountain flower. The pink Indian paintbrush, there must be a God. He paused. There must be a God. It makes no sense there should be such a flower otherwise. Now he sighed when he said this, I'm guessing because as a scientist, he found his science breaking down in the face of something that was just too different to assimilate into all of this. And speaking of my father from the outside, it was part of a long struggle between what people call, the right brain and the left brain. And his right brain tended to win most of the time, I should add. My father's intuitions, though, are pretty common, aren't they? Beauty as an intimation of the divine is something that many people feel. But do people feel that God is beautiful in the same way? When we encounter or observe, for instance, violence, experience the coming to be and the disappearing of people and things we love, or are caught up in the currents of energy and loss that mark our lives, or see spread out before us the spectacle of natural and sometimes human disaster, to say, this is the world that God has made and I will rejoice in him, that's very hard. It's very hard for a lot of people. Flowers, yes, but the whole world and the God of the whole world, that's a little harder to assimilate to this intimation of beauty. So instead, I think many of us actually function with a kind of division in our minds and hearts that we've applied to the things around us in the world. What we like, beautiful flowers, for instance, we will call divine. But what we dislike, like a body that becomes ill, we will often say it is not of God. Rather, it's just part of the stuff we have to deal with, preferably only for a while, before we finally dispose of it. Now, my father at 92, near the end of his life, is in some ways despairing of the world as he looks upon it in his fading days. Maybe like most old people, I don't know. But I think part of his despair and this sense that he has of the world that he carries with him is built into this regretful sense that what is good and beautiful somehow lies in a realm that's apart from this huge collection of the ugly stuff of the world. And at this point, he no longer knows how to access it because it's somewhere else, far away from what daily he's struggling with, which is his weakening body, which indeed is weakening to its end. I think it's fair to say that this is a difficult way to live most of your life. But you know, a lot of people do. For much of what we are engaged in does, in fact, seem unbeautiful and thus godless. Illness, mental disease, struggling to work, struggling to find work, engaging difficult people, including ourselves. And thus, most of our lives and of the world we live in this common perspective, is something we tend to consign at best to what is dreadfully human, and sometimes even to what we consider demonic. God, if there is one by contrast, is for many people mostly an abstract place where we can lodge the good things that we can identify. And for all of our era's materialism, we tend to live, both Christian and non-Christians, it turns out, with a kind of hyper-spiritualized religion. God can't be here, so God must be somewhere else. And often as people experience their lives somewhere else farther and farther away. Now, one of the things I want to lay out for us is that for Christians especially, this way of looking at the world is a special danger and temptation. Because the issue for Christians in particular is located in the contrast embedded at the center of many of our religious claims, which is, for instance, given in the form of the opposition between the seen and the unseen. In general, there's a very high value that Christians place in the unseen. And it's a value linked to the long venerated virtue or gift of faith, quite centrally. So after the resurrection, you may remember, the Apostle Thomas, who misses Jesus' first appearance to the disciples after he has risen, insists that he will not believe that Jesus is risen until he sees the risen Lord with his own eyes. And although Jesus does, in fact, then come and show himself to Thomas, you remember he tells him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are they who have not seen and still believed. It's a judgment that's repeated later in the Bible. For instance, in the first letter of Peter, where Peter commends his listeners for loving Christ, quote, whom you have not seen, and though you see him not now, yet still you believe. That's good. It's good. And of course, faith in what is unseen is furthermore a necessity, just to stay sane. But also, faith in the unseen is a key part of love. In this case, love for God, since it's bound up with trust, with the not yet into which all of our lives, in a sense, and all of our relations lean. But you see, when faith in the unseen becomes the primary way to understand ourselves and our world, including God's relationship to us, we have, whether we mean to or not, frequently untethered ourselves from the very stuff that God gives us through which to know and love God in the first place. Not just the flowers, but the full range of things, of people, of circumstances, challenges, messes, the ups and downs of our life, and even the hard beginnings and endings that mark human existence. Because you see, after all, it is because we exist such as we are, with all these things that make up our lives. It's because we exist that we are God-related persons in the first place. And we exist as bodies in a bodily world. Take that away, we have no relationship with God at all. Now, as Jeff said a moment ago, he's been engaged and is getting all of you engaged in a project involving what some people have called natural theology. I don't know whether you've heard that phrase. But natural theology is a way of thinking about God that is no longer well understood or even appreciated by many, that's meant to take seriously the natural creation as a lens through which God can be known. And I'm just trying in a small way this evening to point out some of the important issues that are bound up with taking natural theology seriously. For one of the main pastoral, and I'm also going to argue one of the main moral consequences of thinking about knowing God through the things that God has made, through the natural world, through creation, that is to bring this world we are part of, including ourselves and one another, to bring our world closer to God, at least in our minds, so that quite frankly, we realize how we're not abandoned in this world, nor that we are called to abandon it in turn, however burdensome this world can seem. That is, natural theology is worth pursuing so that this world, in our hearts and in our minds, can remain very clearly God's world and not some world apart from God. So let me return to this question of the seen and the unseen. Faith in the unseen, as I said, is part of our Christian life and orientation. But complete engagement with the seen is even more foundational, I would argue. After all, Christians make a claim about the great gift and grace of being able to see. To be sure, the Bible, such as in the book of Exodus, makes clear that no one can look at God's face and live. And over again, God is called in the Bible invisible, even in the New Testament. And yet St. John tells us that though, quote, no one has ever seen God, the only Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made God known. Literally, the word is he has exegeted God. He has explained God, laid God out before us. Related to this are also the words that begin John's first epistle, from which we heard a later chapter, 1 John 1. This is how that letter begins. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and touched with our hands, which we have seen, as I said, and touched and heard concerning the word of life, this is what we testify to you. That's how John begins his whole letter. So that invisible though God may be, Yet Jesus mediates this somehow in his own flesh. In his own flesh and in the body he leaves behind, which he calls the church. It's not just his flesh. He also leaves behind a body, he calls it his own, which he labels as the church. And so, John writes, as we heard earlier today, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother or sister, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother or sister whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. It's a very interesting and essential thing to hold together. So understand, we need sight. We need it for our relationship to God. We are made to touch, to bump into things, to listen, and to see things. That is the nature of being a human being and of fulfilling our purpose as human beings. And it is in losing this set of palpable relations, which God gives us, through which we can relate to God. It's through losing these relations, these palpable things, that we lose our way. You remember Paul's famous words at the opening of his letter to the Romans. He writes, ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. For although people knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. So no longer seeing God in the things God had made, everything as a result goes wrong for us. And Paul lists lusts, passions, anger, the whole mess of human life. Seeing creation, in other words, as godless, as without God, leads us to go our own way, using the things of the world, including other people, for our own often disordered purposes. By contrast, says Paul, the proper relationship of the created world to God is where created things, and this includes the things of our own life, point somehow to God, speak of God, tell the truth about God. Again, to use the words John does to describe Jesus, the world in its createdness exegete God. They make God known. Now, what's involved in how this happens? It's not simply by recognizing the beauty in things, the beauty in a flower, or in the mountains, or in the ocean. Because much of the world, and of the world as we experience it, even ourselves, as I said, is not beautiful, but is actually quite difficult and often overwhelming. John, instead, says that the way that the world shows us God is through love. Not love generally, but love as given to another human being, to another brother or sister, in the flesh. We love what is seen. That's the key point. We love what is seen. And that is the way to know God. And when John speaks at the beginning of his letter about this palpable encounter he has had with the incarnated Christ, with Jesus, he speaks of touch, of hearing, and of seeing. But then he says something deeply significant. This palpable encounter is for the sake of what? John says it's for the sake of fellowship among believers. I tell you all these things about Jesus. Why? Quote, so that you might have fellowship with us. Fellowship, a coming together, a set of relationships. In a sense, you could say that the world is given to us so that we can be in relationship with one another, not abstractly, but concretely, physically, in actual encounters. Time and space, as we experience it, are about love. Not the feeling of love, not sentimental love, but as a set of actions and responsibilities, gifts given and received, suffered and engaged. Anyone who says, I love God and hates his brother or sister is a liar. You have to realize how powerful and absolute this claim is. For such a person who does not love his brother or sister whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. It's not by accident that when St. Paul speaks of the fellowship that marks the church is Christ's body, remember, he says that this is epitomized in what? In marriage between a man and a woman. That is, Christ's relation to us as the church is epitomized in the most physical encounter of all that a human being can have, that brings persons together in sexual intercourse even, and finally, in most cases, in a way that gives rise to the new life of children, of other enfleshed beings. And when Paul talks about this in the letter to the Ephesians, he quotes Genesis 1. He's talking about the church. But then he goes and he quotes Genesis 1. The spiritual fellowship of the church is like Adam and Eve, he says. For no man ever hates his own flesh, Paul writes, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. And then he goes back to Genesis. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The life of the Christian in Christ is one of flesh joined to flesh, bone to bone, as Paul goes on to say, even husband to wife. That is to say, what is seen is where we grasp most concretely what Paul calls the mystery of God's work of reconciliation in his Son. We dare not cut off the stuff of the world from God, and so for ourselves render the world godless. Everything in this world takes us to God in particular ways. Often ways we haven't planned. Often ways we've actually tried to avoid. But everything in God's purpose does this. Hence, there is an essentially moral dimension to what I've called natural theology, to claim the world for God, to claim that the unseen God can be grasped through what is seen, is to affirm the moral value of our lives as we are given them and as we live them. And that's absolutely critical, especially in this culture of ours. And we're not just talking about environmental ethics or sexual ethics or about assisted suicide, although all these topics touch on the breadth of natural theology. What is crucial overall is to understand that how we relate to every element of the world, every material, fleshly being and set of circumstances is God revealing, because it is God obedient, as it were. All things related to God, such that at the consummation of history, we can truly say that God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of everything. Or as Paul says, the all in all. Now, I think Christians have struggled with this, partly because, as I said, this press to the unseen as opposed to the seen. And I think we could learn from Jews a little bit, something. I'll just give one example. Take the Sabbath. We can mock all the rules associated with the Sabbath that Orthodox Jews pursue. But in fact, the fundamental divine command around Sabbath keeping is simple. Don't work. That's it. That's the one command. Don't do any work. And why? In order to demonstrate and remember and soak in, as it were, two truths. That is, that God makes all things, and that God saves us in all circumstances. Those are the two rationales used for the fourth commandment in Exodus and Deuteronomy. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea. You shall remember, secondly, that the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Those are the two reasons Israel is asked to keep the Sabbath. That is, Sabbath keeping is meant to open our eyes and heart to the fact that the world is the artifact artifact and gift of God in all its detail. Light and dark, water and land, hills, mountains, deserts, cold, heat, plants, insects, birds, fishes, reptiles, animals, and women and men. All of it from God. And so too, the encounters of our lives, the circumstances, labor, rest, oppression, escape, struggle, release. The landscape, that is, not only of the material world, but of our relations with others. All of that is from God as well. And keeping the Sabbath was and is meant to bring all things, all discrete and particular realities, back into focus as divinely made and divinely given to us. No work, the main command of Sabbath keeping, means simply providing a space in our life every week to see this. You are to be immersed in the simple fact that God has created everything and that it all points back to him. Now you might think that, can't we just do this anyway? It's actually hard. That's the point. I remember reading about a famous secularized Jewish writer in the early 20th century. Franz Rosenzweig is his name if you're interested, who was slowly trying to unsecularize himself, as to say, to get back in touch with what it meant to be a Jew and to relearn his Jewish identity. And as part of that, he started trying to do the keeping of the Sabbath. So over several months, even years, he did, or he didn't do this and that. But for a long time, he continued to write letters on the Sabbath, even though in fact that's not permitted according to Orthodox teaching. He used to write letters, and he did so with the rationale that my friendships are good things, he would say, and so tending to them through writing letters to them has to be a good thing too, doesn't it? Surely God would approve of my sitting down and writing letters to my friends. But finally he got to the point where he stopped even his letter writing on the Sabbath as well. One of his secular colleagues said to them, "So have you given up on the goodness of your friendships?" And Rosenzweig said, "Not at all. Rather," he said, "I have learned that even my friends are utter gifts from God, and I am not their creator." It's a fascinating way to look at what a relationship is that we often don't even see. Even a world of love, then, is one that God has given us, made for us, sustains for us, and leads us through. And just here is where Jesus' own criticisms of certain forms of Sabbath keeping in his day came in. To care for the world that God gives us, including human persons, is a moral demand. And thus seeing this world, taking it seriously in this moral demand, is revelatory of God himself. We Christians have often tended to take off from Jesus' words into an attitude that in fact demeans the everyday stuff of life, rather than, as it were, filling it up with its divine meaning and value. The world is given to us in order that we might see God and rejoice in him, not to use it as a tool for achieving some other set of goals, even if we consider them spiritual goals. So, to end, the very project of reclaiming natural theology for the Christian church that Jeff is involved in, is to say, drawing us back into the world of things and events, whether beautiful or horrific or just plain common, is profoundly necessary for us. For if we cannot engage what we see before our eyes, what we touch and hear, as something fraught with eternal moral significance, that is, just here is where our encounter with God takes place at any moment in the day, upon which rests our destiny. If we can't do that, how shall we ever know God at all, be touched by him, seen by him, heard by him in a way that we can respond to with a yes? We love because he first loved us. And thus, if anyone says, "I love God," and hates his brother or sister, that person is a liar. For he who does not love his brother or sister whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God should love his brother and sister also. You and I cannot escape this world. And what Jesus tells us is we should never wish to, for it's here that God comes to us. In Jesus' name, amen.